What if you were in a plane crash? Aviophobia, or the irrational fear of flying, is one of the more common phobias out there. This is despite the fact, mathematically speaking, we are much more likely to die from a coconut falling on our heads than in a plane crash. Nevertheless, in 2014, at least 40% of airplane passengers told ABC News that they are scared of flying. Aviophobia is also a booming industry, with phone apps, YouTube video series, and books all dedicated to helping travelers to overcome their dread at having to ride in a single seat 35,000 feet in the air. For some people, it's the turbulence that scares them. For others, it's the feeling of being a human sardine in a pressurized can. Finally, there are those who simply refuse to believe the statistics and are convinced that they will be the exception to the rule. Here is the single most important thing to remember if you are skittish about planes. You would have to fly every day for 55,000 years before you would ever experience a fatal accident. Even better news is the fact that 2017 was the safest year on record for commercial aviation. However, if by some freaky, inexplicable chance you do find yourself in a plane crash, it might be comforting to know that since the 1980s, advances in plane technology have made even crashing surprisingly safe. A study conducted by the US government found that between 1983 and 2000, most plane crashes had a survival rate of between 81 and 100%. Still worried about boarding your next flight? Well, if the worst case scenario does happen, and your flight has to make an emergency landing over land or water, remember this. Passengers have survived horrific crashes in the past. Take for instance the crash of Yemenia Flight 626 in 2009. At some point, while the large airlander soared above the Indian Ocean, the in-flight crew took inappropriate actions, in the language of the after-accident investigation, and the plane stalled. Flight 626 then tumbled headlong into the water at a high speed. Despite this, one 13-year-old girl, Bahia Bakari, aka the Miracle Girl, managed to survive by clinging to a piece of the wrecked plane for over 9 hours. Another incredible survivor story concerns 4-year-old Cecilia Shan, who was the only person to survive the crash of Northwest Airlines Flight 255 in 1987. Because the flight's crew incorrectly set the plane's flaps and slats before takeoff, 154 people perished that day. Young Cecilia managed to survive by hiding underneath a seat. Passengers have even managed to survive terrorist bombings on board planes too. On January 26, 1972, 22-year-old Vesna Vulovic, a Serbian flight attendant, managed to survive the bombing of JAT Yugoslav Airlines Flight 357. Vulovic was fortunate enough to be trapped by a food cart when the flight descended from a height of 33,333 feet in the air. If you're still worried about flying, then here are some tips to take to heart before putting your feet in business class or coach. First of all, survival starts before the plane has even taken off. Indeed, safety starts way before you even book your ticket. If you want to survive a plane crash, then you have to be in great physical shape. Given that most people will only have at best 90 seconds to exit a burning plane, you need to have excellent cardiovascular health and plenty of stamina. It also goes without saying that you should always try to remain awake on your flights. Tired and groggy bodies are slower to react to situations where time is of the essence. Always stay alert. When it comes down to picking a seat, remember the 5-row rule. According to an article published in Popular Mechanics back in 2007, the safest place to be is the rear of the plane. The authors came to this conclusion after studying a series of accidents and finding out where the survivors sat. However, accident researcher Ed Galea corrected this theory by stating that no matter where you sit, it is important to remember that chances of survival go down if you have to pass more than 5 rows to escape the plane. Basically, it is in your best interest to sit less than 5 rows behind or in front of one of the plane's exit doors. While we're still on the topic of seating, it is almost common knowledge at this point that the middle seats are the safest seats on any given plane. The least safest? That would be the aisle seat smack dab in the middle of the cabin. Those seats might make going to the bathroom easier, but saying "excuse me" to your neighbors a few times during the flight might just be worth it when it comes down to your personal safety. So you've prepared yourself accordingly, and yet your plane still crashes. Well, you can still survive. If your plane is forced to land on a body of water, which is most likely given the majority of the world is covered by water, take comfort in the fact that a full 95% of all passengers who have experienced crashes have survived. Wearing sturdy footwear and being able to correctly unbuckle yourself from your seat could also increase your chances of survival. That being said, most crash landings in the water are so-called out-of-control crashes that are the result of major airplane failure. Such crashes tend to be more fatal than others. If your plane lands on green grass or desert sand somewhere, then fires and smoke inhalation are what you should worry about. In that regard, what you wear on your flight becomes especially important. As a rule, try to avoid wearing flammable materials like acetate, nylon, or rayon. Wool and cotton are slow to ignite, so stick to wearing them during your next flight. Also, whether or not your plane lands on solid ground or on the ocean, it is important to remember that how you brace yourself is important. If there is a seat in front of you, cross your hands and rest your head on them. If there is no seat in front of you, then tighten the belt and bend over as far as you can. Thankfully, if you forget any of this, each flight comes equipped with a helpful safety guide that you should always read before you take off. Finally, it is key to remember what types of injuries that you are most likely to suffer following a plane crash. According to the US National Library of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health, lower limb fractures are the most prevalent injuries in fatal and non-fatal crashes, while head injuries, open wounds, upper extremity fractures, and internal injuries are also common. Of these injuries, head trauma tends to be the most fatal. While passengers cannot wear football or bicycle helmets on their flights, that does not mean that steps cannot be taken to minimize the risk of head trauma. When bracing for impact, pay especially close attention to the position of your head and neck. In closing, don't worry about turbulence. While it used to occasionally ground planes in the very early days of flying, these days planes are so well built that turbulence rarely amounts to anything beyond mild discomfort. Also remember to place the oxygen mask on yourself first before trying to help someone else. Follow the lights on the cabin floor to identify the nearest exit, which, if you're being safe, is less than 5 rows in front or behind you. Try not to panic, focus on your breathing, and always have a survivor's mindset. And at the end of the day, always keep in mind that plane crashes are exceptionally, even extraordinarily, rare.